In 1855, a Lancashire paper mill promised work to the desperate, but its machines would press more than wood and rags into its sheets. Viewers are invited to share which country or state they are listening from, as this history reaches far beyond the borders of Lancashire. The year is 1855. Lancashire, England, is a land of smoke and steam, its valleys and towns transformed by the relentless march of the Industrial Revolution. The air is thick with the scent of coal and the constant thrum of machinery. Rows of brick chimneys pierce the low sky, and the rivers run gray with the runoff of progress. In the towns and villages, men, women, and children rise before dawn, drawn by the promise of wages, however meager, that might keep hunger at bay for another week. For the working poor, life is a daily negotiation with hardship. The fields that once fed families have given way to factories and mills. The old rhythms of rural life are replaced by the clang of bells and the whistle of steam. In the crowded alleys of towns like Burnley and Accrington, families huddle in damp tenements, their hopes pinned on the next payday. The mills, for all their dangers, offer a lifeline, a place to earn, to belong, to survive. It is in this world of soot and striving that the new paper mill arrives. The structure rises on the edge of a small town, its brick walls and tall windows promising modernity and employment. Word spreads quickly. The mill is hiring. Posters appear on lampposts and in public houses, promising steady work for able hands. The owner, a man of some means and mysterious origin, is said to be expanding his operations, eager to meet the growing demand for paper in a nation hungry for news, books, and bureaucracy. For many, the mill's arrival is a blessing. The cotton trade has faltered, and the mines are perilous. Paper, it is said, is the future, a clean industry, or so the advertisements claim. The work is hard, but the wages are regular. Men line up at the gates before dawn, caps in hand, hoping for a place on the floor. Women and even children are hired to sort rags, feed the pulping vats, and tend the endless rollers that press the wet pulp into sheets. The mill itself is a marvel of Victorian engineering. Steam engines power the great wheels and belts that drive the machines. Water from the nearby river is channeled into the vats, where rags and wood are ground to a fibrous slurry. The air inside is warm and damp, heavy with the scent of wet paper and the tang of chemicals. Gas lamps flicker along the walls, casting long shadows across the humming machinery. The constant hiss of steam and the rhythmic thud of pistons create a kind of mechanical heartbeat, steady and inescapable. For the workers, the days are long and the work is relentless. Hands are stained with ink and pulp, lungs filled with the fine dust that settles on every surface. Yet there is pride, too, in the stacks of finished paper that leave the mill each week, bound for printers in Manchester and London. The owner, rarely seen on the floor, is said to be a man of vision, strict but fair. He keeps to himself, his office door always closed, his comings and goings marked by the echo of boots on stone. In the evenings, the workers spill out into the town, their faces drawn but hopeful. Wages are spent at the market, in the public houses, or saved against the next hard time. Children play in the shadow of the mill, their laughter mingling with the distant rumble of the night shift. The town, once quiet and insular, begins to change. New shops open, and strangers arrive in search of work. The mill, for all its noise and smoke, brings a sense of possibility. Yet beneath the surface there is unease. The machines are unforgiving, and accidents are common. A hand caught in the rollers, a foot slipped on a wet floor. These are the risks of mill life, accepted as the price of progress. The owner's reticence, at first dismissed as eccentricity, becomes a subject of quiet speculation. Some say he is haunted by the loss of a wife, others that he is simply a man of business, uninterested in the lives of those he employs. Still, the mill's promise is undeniable. For the first time in years, there is work enough for all who seek it. The town's fortunes seem to rise with the smoke from the mill's chimneys. The church bells ring for weddings and christenings, and the market square is busy on Saturdays. The paper produced here is said to be of the finest quality, strong, smooth, and white as new snow. But as the months pass, small things begin to unsettle the town. A worker fails to return home after a late shift. A new hire, seen only briefly, is never spoken of again. At first, these disappearances are explained away. A man run off to Manchester, a woman eloped, a boy taken by the fever that still haunts the poorest quarters. The mill, after all, is a place of comings and goings. In a world where people vanish for reasons as varied as hope and despair, who is to say what has become of a single soul? Yet the unease grows. The owner's presence becomes more spectral, his movements more secretive. The grinding rooms, where the rags and wood are reduced to pulp, are kept locked at night. Deliveries arrive at odd hours, and the sound of machinery can be heard long after the day's work is done. Some workers whisper of strange shapes, glimpsed through the fogged windows, of shadows that move against the flicker of gaslight. Still, the mill continues to run, its machines pressing on through the seasons. The town, bound to the rhythms of work and want, has little choice but to accept what the mill offers. For most, the promise of a wage is enough to quiet any doubts. The paper flows out, the money flows in, and the mill's shadow lengthens over the town. But the story of the bone mill is only beginning. In the months to come, the disappearances will multiply, and the whispers will grow louder. The secrets pressed into the very fibers of the mill's paper will begin to surface, and the town will be forced to confront a truth more chilling than any could have imagined. The first disappearance was almost invisible, a ripple in the daily tide of hardship that defined Lancashire's working class. It was late spring when Thomas Hargreaves, a young man of 22, failed to return home after his shift at the mill. His mother waited by the window, watching the fog roll in from the moors, her eyes searching for the familiar shape of her son. But the night passed, and Thomas did not appear. At first, there was little alarm. Men sometimes left for better wages in Manchester or Liverpool, or simply vanished, swallowed by the anonymity of industrial England. The mill's foreman, when questioned, shrugged and said Thomas had likely found work elsewhere. The owner, approached by Thomas's mother, offered a few clipped words of sympathy but no explanation. He suggested, as others did, that young men were restless by nature. The town, accustomed to loss, accepted this reasoning. Life in Lancashire was a constant negotiation with absence. Fathers lost to the mines, children to fever, mothers to the slow grind of poverty. The mills and factories drew people in and cast them out with equal indifference. A missing worker was a sorrow but not a scandal. Yet for those who knew Thomas, the explanation rang hollow. He was not the sort to leave without a word. He had a sweetheart, a mother who depended on him, and no debts to speak of. His boots and coat were left behind in the cramped room he shared with his brother. His pay packet, collected the day before, sat unopened on the mantel. The details, small but telling, began to trouble those closest to him. Still, the mill's promise of work and the town's need for stability kept questions at bay. The owner, a man named Mr. Blackwood, maintained his distance. He was seen less often on the floor, his office door closed for hours at a time. When he did appear, it was with a brisk nod and averted eyes. The workers, wary of losing their positions, spoke of Thomas only in whispers. As the weeks passed, the memory of Thomas Hargreaves faded into the background hum of daily life. The mill's machines continued their ceaseless work, pressing rags and wood into the fine white sheets that brought prosperity to the town. The river, swollen with spring rains, carried away the detritus of industry, its surface reflecting the glow of gas lamps and the silhouettes of laborers trudging home. But the silence around Thomas's disappearance was not complete. In the public house, over pints of bitter, a few men wondered aloud about the locked grinding rooms and the owner's late-night visits to the mill. A washerwoman claimed to have seen Mr. Blackwood hauling heavy sacks from his carriage after midnight, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The stories, half-formed and uncertain, drifted through the town like smoke. Then, in early summer, another worker vanished. This time it was Mary Ellen Shaw, a widow in her 30s who sorted rags in the mill's lower rooms. She was last seen at the end of her shift, her apron bundled under her arm, her face drawn with fatigue. Her neighbors assumed she had gone to visit a sister in Burnley, but when days passed with no word, concern grew. Her small room above the bakery remained untouched, her few possessions undisturbed. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. Each disappearance was met with the same shrug of indifference from the mill's management, the same quiet acceptance from the town. The owner's explanations were always plausible: a better job, a family emergency, a sudden illness. The workers, bound by necessity, dared not press too hard. The mill was their lifeline, and to question its workings was to risk everything. Yet, as the summer wore on, the unease deepened. The grinding rooms, always locked at night, became a source of fascination and fear. The sound of machinery could be heard long after the day's work was done, echoing through the empty corridors. The owner's carriage was seen at odd hours, its wheels rattling over the cobblestones, its driver silent and watchful. Some workers began to notice other oddities. The vats of pulp, usually filled with a predictable mix of rags and wood, sometimes contained fragments that seemed out of place: a button, a scrap of cloth, a lock of hair. The foreman dismissed these as accidents, the inevitable result of careless sorting. But the explanations did little to ease the growing sense of dread. The town's children, ever attuned to the anxieties of their elders, invented stories about the mill. They spoke of ghosts in the grinding rooms, of faces pressed into the paper, of voices heard in the hiss of steam. The adults, for their part, tried to ignore these tales, but the fear was real. The mill, once a symbol of hope, had become a place of secrets. By autumn, the number of missing had grown to 4. Each case was met with the same pattern of denial and resignation. The owner, when pressed, grew curt and defensive. He reminded the workers of their good fortune, of the wages that kept their families fed. The town's leaders, eager to preserve the fragile prosperity the mill had brought, discouraged talk of foul play. But the disappearances could not be ignored forever. The families of the missing began to gather, their grief turning to anger. They demanded answers, but found only silence. The mill's gates, once open to all, now seemed to guard something more than machinery and pulp. The story of the bone mill was no longer just a whisper. It was a question that hung over the town, a shadow that lengthened with each passing day. The machines pressed on, but the sense of safety was gone. In the heart of Lancashire, a mystery was taking shape, one that would haunt the town for generations to come. By the time the leaves turned and the first frost crept across the fields, the number of missing had reached 7. Each absence was a wound, slow to heal and impossible to ignore. The town, once bustling with the hopeful energy of new industry, now moved with a wary caution. Mothers called their children home before dusk. Men walked in pairs after the late shift, casting nervous glances at the looming silhouette of the mill. The disappearances followed no clear pattern. Young and old, men and women, newcomers and lifelong residents, all vanished without warning. The only common thread was their employment at the paper mill. The town's constable, a man more accustomed to settling disputes over livestock than investigating mysteries, found himself overwhelmed. He dutifully recorded each report, his ledger filling with names and dates, but the trail always led back to the mill and ended at its locked doors. Rumors began to take root, fed by the silence of the mill's owner and the strange happenings within its walls. Some whispered that the mill was cursed, that the machines demanded a price in flesh for every bale of paper produced. Others spoke of the owner, Mr. Blackwood, and his peculiar habits. He was seen less and less in public, his face pale and drawn, his eyes darting with suspicion. At night, the glow of gaslight could be seen in his office window, long after the last worker had gone home. The grinding rooms became the focus of the town's anxiety. Locked and guarded, they were off limits to all but a select few. The sound of machinery, the relentless churn of gears and the low grinding moan of the pulping vats seemed to echo through the night, a constant reminder of the mill's presence. Some workers claimed to hear strange noises from behind the locked doors, muffled cries, the clatter of chains, the sharp hiss of escaping steam. Deliveries to the mill became more frequent and more secretive. Heavy wagons arrived at odd hours, their contents hidden beneath tarpaulins. The drivers, strangers to the town, spoke little and left quickly. The owner himself was seen directing these deliveries, his voice low and urgent. Once, a group of boys hiding in the shadows saw him struggle with a particularly heavy sack, dragging it through the rain-soaked yard to the heart of the mill. They told their parents, but the story was dismissed as childish fancy. The town's leaders, desperate to maintain order, urged calm. They reminded the people of the prosperity the mill had brought, of the jobs and the new shops and the steady flow of money. They warned against wild speculation, insisting that the missing had simply moved on, as people so often did in these uncertain times. But their reassurances rang hollow. The fear was too deep, the losses too many. By winter, the number of vanished had climbed to 10. The constable, his confidence eroded by failure, appealed to the authorities in Manchester for assistance. A detective was dispatched, a man named Inspector Latham, whose reputation for thoroughness was matched only by his skepticism. He arrived on a cold, gray morning, his coat buttoned tight against the wind, and began his inquiries with a methodical patience. Inspector Latham interviewed the families of the missing, walked the muddy lanes between the mill and the workers' cottages, and spent long hours observing the mill's operations. He noted the locked grinding rooms, the late-night deliveries, and the owner's evasive answers. He questioned the workers, who spoke of their fear in hushed tones, and the townspeople, who offered little more than rumors and half-remembered sightings. The inspector's presence brought a measure of hope, but also a new tension. The owner, Mr. Blackwood, bristled at the intrusion. He insisted that his business was above reproach, that the disappearances were unfortunate but unrelated to the mill. He produced records of wages paid, letters of reference for those who had left, and receipts for every delivery. Yet, for all his documentation, there remained a sense that something was being hidden. The grinding rooms, when finally inspected, revealed little. The machinery was spotless, the floors scrubbed clean, the vats filled with the usual slurry of rags and wood. But Inspector Latham was not satisfied. He returned at night, accompanied by the constable, and listened to the sounds that emanated from behind the locked doors. He watched as the owner moved through the shadows, his lantern casting long, wavering beams across the damp stone. It was during one of these nocturnal vigils that a new disappearance occurred. A young woman named Alice Proctor, recently hired to tend the sorting tables, failed to return home after her shift. Her friends recalled seeing her leave the floor, her face pale and anxious, her steps hurried. The owner claimed she had been dismissed for tardiness, but her belongings remained in the workers' dormitory, untouched. The town's patience snapped. Families gathered outside the mill, demanding answers. The constable, emboldened by the inspector's presence, pressed for a full search of the premises. The owner relented, but only after hours of negotiation. The search, conducted by lantern light, turned up nothing conclusive, only the endless hum of machinery and the cold, damp smell of pulp and steam. Yet the sense of dread only deepened. The inspector, convinced that the truth lay somewhere within the mill's walls, resolved to stay until the mystery was solved. The townspeople, caught between hope and fear, watched the mill with wary eyes. The machines pressed on, their rhythm unbroken, as if indifferent to the suffering they had wrought. By the time the first thaw came, the number of missing had reached 14. The Bone Mill, as it was now called in fearful whispers, had become a place of legend and terror. The story of its vanished workers spread beyond the town, carried by travelers and merchants to the far corners of Lancashire. The mill's shadow, once a symbol of progress, now stretched long and dark across the land. The investigation was far from over. The inspector's questions had only just begun to pierce the veil of secrecy that shrouded the mill. The town, united in its fear, waited for answers that seemed always just out of reach. And in the heart of the mill, the machines pressed on, their secrets locked away in the endless churn of pulp and steam. The winter of 1855 settled over Lancashire with a heavy hand. The moors were shrouded in mist, and the town's narrow lanes glistened with frost. The mill's chimneys belched steam into the low sky, and the hiss of machinery was a constant presence, even as the world outside seemed to hold its breath. The disappearances, now numbering 14, had become the town's silent obsession. Every conversation, every glance, seemed to circle back to the bone mill and its secrets. Inspector Latham, undeterred by the owner's evasions and the lack of physical evidence, pressed on with his investigation. He spent his days interviewing workers, his nights watching the mill from the shadows. The owner, Mr. Blackwood, had grown more reclusive, his face gaunt and his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. He was seen only in brief flashes. A silhouette in a window, a figure hurrying across the yard, a voice barking orders from behind a closed door. The grinding rooms remained locked, their secrets guarded by heavy iron keys that never left the owner's person. The workers, cowed by fear and the threat of dismissal, spoke little of what they saw or heard. Yet rumors persisted. Some claimed to have seen Blackwood moving through the mill at all hours, his lantern bobbing in the darkness. Others whispered of strange stains on the floor, of sacks that seemed to shift and groan as they were dragged across the stone. It was on a night of biting wind and lashing rain that the story took its most fateful turn. Martha Proctor, the wife of the most recent missing worker, could not sleep. Her husband, John, had vanished 3 days before, and the silence from the mill had become unbearable. She watched from her window as the gas lights flickered in the distance, her heart pounding with dread and determination. Shortly after midnight, she saw movement at the mill's gate. A lantern bobbed in the darkness, and the tall, stooped figure of Mr. Blackwood emerged, a heavy sack slung over his shoulder. He moved with purpose, his boots splashing through puddles, his breath visible in the cold air. Martha, wrapping herself in a shawl, slipped from her cottage and followed at a distance, her footsteps muffled by the rain. She kept to the shadows, her eyes fixed on the owner as he made his way to the mill's side entrance. He fumbled with his keys, glancing over his shoulder before slipping inside. Martha crept closer, pressing herself against the cold brick wall. Through a crack in the door, she watched as Blackwood hauled the sack down a narrow corridor, his lantern casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Inside, the mill was alive with the sounds of machinery. The grinding rooms, usually silent at this hour, hummed with activity. Martha watched as Blackwood disappeared into the heart of the mill, the sack dragging behind him. She waited, her breath shallow, as the minutes stretched into an hour. The rain beat against the windows, and the hiss of steam mingled with the low, rhythmic thud of the pulping vats. At last Blackwood reappeared, his hands empty, his face pale and drawn. He paused at the door, listening to the storm, before extinguishing his lantern and slipping back into the night. Martha, trembling with fear and cold, hurried home, her mind racing with what she had seen. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the answers to the town's questions lay within those locked rooms. The next morning, Martha went to Inspector Latham. She recounted her story in a voice barely above a whisper, her hands twisting in her lap. The inspector listened intently, his expression grave. He asked for every detail: the time, the route, the weight of the sack, the sounds from within the mill. Martha answered as best she could, her memory sharpened by fear. Latham wasted no time. He gathered the constable and a small group of trusted townsmen, and together they approached the mill. The owner, summoned from his office, met them at the door, his face a mask of polite irritation. Latham explained that, in light of recent events and Martha's testimony, a full search of the premises was now necessary. Blackwood protested, citing the sanctity of his business and the rights of property, but the inspector was resolute. The search began in the grinding rooms. The air was thick with the smell of wet pulp and chemicals, the floor slick beneath their boots. The machinery, still running, filled the space with a deafening roar. Latham ordered the engines stopped, and the sudden silence was almost as unsettling as the noise. The men moved through the rooms, their lanterns illuminating every corner, every vat, every pile of rags. In one corner they found a series of heavy sacks, their contents damp and oddly shaped. Latham ordered them opened. Inside were rags, as expected. But mixed among them were other things: buttons, scraps of clothing, a shoe with a broken lace. The inspector's hands trembled as he sifted through the contents, his mind racing with possibilities. The search continued through the night. In the deepest part of the mill, near the largest pulping vat, they found stains on the floor that could not be explained by ink or pulp alone. The constable, his face pale, pointed out a faint metallic smell that lingered in the air. Latham took note of everything, his notebook filling with observations and questions. The owner, confronted with the evidence, grew defensive. He insisted that the sacks were simply waste, that the stains were the result of a spilled dye, that the grinding rooms were locked to prevent theft. But his explanations rang hollow. The workers, emboldened by the inspector's presence, began to speak more freely. They described the owner's late-night activities, the strange deliveries, the sounds that echoed through the mill after dark. By dawn, the search had yielded more questions than answers. The evidence was circumstantial, but the sense of unease was now impossible to ignore. The town, once bound by the promise of the mill, was now united in suspicion and fear. The machines, silent for the first time in months, seemed to hold their breath, as if waiting for the truth to emerge. The bone mill had become a place of secrets, its walls heavy with the weight of the missing. The investigation was far from over, but the first cracks had appeared in the owner's carefully constructed facade. The town, for the first time, dared to hope that the mystery might yet be solved, and that justice, however long delayed, might finally be done. Inspector Latham's search of the bone mill marked a turning point in the town's long ordeal. The mill, once a symbol of hope, now stood as a fortress of suspicion. The constable and his men, lanterns in hand, moved through the dim corridors, their boots echoing on stone floors slick with moisture. The air was thick with the cold metallic tang of machinery and the sour scent of pulp. Every surface seemed to sweat with condensation, and the hiss of steam pipes was a constant ghostly presence. The grinding rooms at last opened to scrutiny, revealed their secrets slowly. The great iron vats, usually churning with a slurry of rags and wood, were now still. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the drip of water and the distant creak of settling beams. The men moved carefully, wary of the slick floors and the looming shapes of dormant machines. Their lanterns cast long, wavering shadows, and every corner seemed to hold the possibility of revelation. Latham directed his men to examine the pulping vats. The contents were thick and gray, flecked with bits of cloth and wood. But as they sifted through the pulp, they found things that did not belong. A brass button, a length of ribbon, a small battered locket. The inspector collected these items, his gloved hands steady but his mind racing. Each fragment was a silent witness, a clue to the fate of the missing. The search moved to the drying rooms, where great sheets of wet paper hung from wooden racks. The air here was warmer, heavy with the smell of damp cellulose and the faint, acrid tang of chemicals. The men examined the racks, their fingers tracing the edges of the paper. In one corner, a worker pointed out a sheet that seemed different from the rest. It was thicker, its surface marred by faint, irregular shapes. Latham held it up to the light, and for a moment, the outline of what looked like a human hand seemed to emerge from the fibers, only to vanish when the angle changed. The inspector said nothing, but the men exchanged uneasy glances. The mill, it seemed, was giving up its secrets one by one, but each answer only raised more questions. The owner, Mr. Blackwood, hovered at the edge of the search, his face pale and drawn. He protested at every turn, insisting that the findings were the result of carelessness or sabotage. But his words carried little weight now. The evidence, though circumstantial, was mounting. In the engine room, the constable discovered a pile of discarded clothing, hidden behind a stack of coal. The garments were stained and torn, some bearing the initials of the missing workers. Latham catalogued each item, his notebook filling with details. The workers, emboldened by the inspector's presence, began to speak more freely. They described the owner's late-night visits, the strange deliveries, the sounds that echoed through the mill after dark. The investigation extended to the mill's records. Latham pored over ledgers and payroll books, searching for patterns. He found discrepancies, names that appeared for a few weeks then vanished, wages paid to workers who had not been seen in months, deliveries recorded at odd hours. The owner's explanations grew more strained, his temper fraying at the edges. Outside, the town watched and waited. The mill's silence was a constant reminder of the mystery that gripped the community. The market was quieter, the public house subdued. Children no longer played near the mill, and even the most desperate job seekers hesitated at its gates. The promise of steady wages had been replaced by a fear that clung to every conversation. Inside the mill, the search continued. Latham ordered the vats drained, the machinery dismantled piece by piece. The work was slow and exhausting, the men's nerves stretched thin by the constant sense of dread. In the bottom of one vat, they found a ring, its surface etched with the initials MES. Mary Ellen Shaw, one of the first to vanish. The discovery sent a chill through the room. The inspector pocketed the ring, his resolve hardening. The most unsettling discoveries came not from the machinery, but from the finished product. As the investigators examined stacks of paper ready for shipment, they noticed oddities, faint, unexplainable shapes embedded in the fibers, as if something had been pressed into the pulp and then vanished. In the right light, some sheets seemed to reveal the suggestion of a face, a hand, a lock of hair. The effect was subtle, easily dismissed as a trick of the eye, but for those who knew the mill's history, it was impossible to ignore. Latham sent samples of the paper and pulp to Manchester, hoping that the city's doctors and scientists might provide answers. The process was slow, the technology of the time limited. The experts examined the fibers under magnifying glasses, searching for traces of bone or tissue. Their reports were cautious, filled with words like inconclusive and suggestive. The science could not keep pace with the horror of the suspicions. The town's fear grew with each passing day. The mill, once a place of hope, had become a symbol of dread. The workers, their livelihoods at stake, faced a terrible choice: to stay and risk vanishing, or to leave and face starvation. The owner, his authority crumbling, retreated further into isolation. The inspector, for all his efforts, found himself chasing shadows, the truth always just out of reach. Yet the evidence, though fragmentary, was damning. The mill's machines, designed to grind and press, had become instruments of disappearance. The paper, meant to carry words and ideas, now seemed to bear silent witness to the town's darkest fears. The bone mill, once a beacon of progress, had become a place of legend, a story whispered in fear, where every page told a story no one wished to read. The investigation was not over. The inspector pressed on, determined to find answers. The town, united in its anxiety, waited for justice. And the mill, its machines stilled at last, seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that its secrets were finally coming to light. The samples from the bone mill, paper, pulp, and the odd fragments found in the machinery, traveled by train to Manchester, where the city's most learned doctors and chemists awaited. The Victorian age was an era of scientific ambition, but its tools were still crude, its knowledge incomplete. The experts received the packages with a mixture of curiosity and unease, aware that the eyes of Lancashire were upon them. In a laboratory lit by flickering gaslight, the scientists set to work. They examined the paper under magnifying glasses, searching for anything that might explain the strange shapes and textures. The fibers, they noted, were unusually coarse in some places, and in others, oddly smooth. In a few sheets, the faint outline of what looked like a human profile seemed to emerge, only to vanish when the paper was turned. The effect was subtle, but it sent a chill through even the most rational minds. The pulp was more difficult to analyze. The vats had been drained and the residue collected in jars, each labeled with the date and location of its origin. The chemists sifted through the gray, lumpy mass, searching for traces of bone, hair, or tissue. They found fragments, tiny, brittle pieces that might have been wood, or might have been something else. Under the microscope, the distinction blurred. The technology of the time could not say for certain. The buttons, ribbons, and scraps of cloth were easier to identify. Some bore the initials or marks of the missing workers. A locket, when pried open, revealed a faded miniature portrait of a woman, her features barely visible beneath the grime. The scientists cataloged each item, their reports growing longer and more uncertain with every passing day. The findings, when sent back to Inspector Latham, were cautious. The experts could not confirm the presence of human remains in the paper or pulp, but neither could they rule it out. The shapes in the paper, they wrote, were suggestive of organic material, but the process of pulping and bleaching had destroyed any clear evidence. The buttons and clothing, they agreed, belonged to the missing, but how they had come to be mixed with the rags and wood was a question for the law, not for science. The inspector, frustrated but undeterred, pressed on. He shared the reports with the town's leaders, who read them with growing alarm. The evidence was circumstantial, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. 14 workers had vanished, their belongings found in the mill, their fates written in the very paper that left its doors. The owner, Mr. Blackwood, continued to protest his innocence, but his words rang hollow in the face of mounting suspicion. The town, meanwhile, was gripped by a new kind of fear. The mill, once a place of hope, had become a source of dread. The children's stories grew darker. They spoke of cursed paper, of faces that watched from the pages of books, of voices that whispered in the night. The adults, for all their rationality, found themselves glancing twice at every sheet of paper, searching for the faint outline of a hand or a face. The market, once lively, was subdued. The public house, usually filled with laughter and song, was now a place of quiet conversation and wary glances. The mill's workers, those who remained, moved through their days with a sense of doom. Some left town altogether, seeking work in distant cities. Others stayed, bound by poverty and fear, their eyes hollow and their voices hushed. The legend of the bone mill began to take shape. It was said that the paper produced there was cursed, that anyone who wrote upon it would suffer misfortune. Some claimed that the spirits of the missing haunted the mill, their faces pressed into the very fibers of the paper. The stories spread beyond the town, carried by travelers and merchants to the far corners of Lancashire. The mill's reputation, once a source of pride, was now a mark of shame. Inspector Latham, for his part, refused to give in to superstition. He continued his investigation, interviewing every worker, every delivery man, every resident who had set foot in the mill. He traced the shipments of paper, searching for any clue that might explain the disappearances. He questioned the owner relentlessly, probing for inconsistencies in his story. But the owner, for all his evasions, revealed little. He insisted that the mill was innocent, that the disappearances were the work of outsiders or the result of misfortune. He pointed to the lack of concrete evidence, the inconclusive reports from Manchester, the absence of bodies. He accused the inspector of persecuting him, of destroying his business and his reputation. The inspector, weary but resolute, pressed on. He knew that the truth was close, that the answers lay somewhere within the mill's walls. But the evidence, for all its weight, remained just out of reach. The law, bound by the limits of science and the need for proof, could not act on suspicion alone. The town, caught between fear and hope, waited. The mill's machines, once the heartbeat of the community, now stood silent more often than not. The river, swollen with spring rains, carried away the waste of industry, its surface reflecting the gray sky and the anxious faces of those who watched from the banks. The legend of the bone mill grew with every telling. It became a story whispered in fear, a warning to children and a caution to strangers. The paper, once a symbol of progress, was now a source of dread. The town, for all its suffering, clung to the hope that justice would be done, that the truth would emerge from the shadows. But the shadows were deep, and the truth, for all its weight, was elusive. The inspector pressed on, the town waited, and the mill, its secrets pressed into every sheet of paper, stood silent and watchful on the edge of the moor. As spring crept over Lancashire, the town's mood grew ever more brittle. The bone mill, once a beacon of industry, now loomed over the landscape like a monument to vanished hope. The air was thick with rumor and dread. Even the river seemed to flow more slowly past the mill's foundations, as if reluctant to carry its secrets downstream. The inspector's investigation, though relentless, had reached a kind of impasse. The evidence was damning in its accumulation, but frustratingly incomplete. The missing workers' belongings, the odd fragments in the pulp, the suggestive shapes in the finished paper, all pointed to something terrible, yet nothing could be proven beyond doubt. The law, bound by the standards of the day, demanded certainty. The town, however, had already made up its mind. Fear had become a living thing in the streets. Children hurried home before dusk, clutching their school books tightly, their eyes wide with stories of haunted paper and restless spirits. Housewives, once proud to use the mill's fine sheets for letters and ledgers, now burned them in their hearths, watching the smoke curl up the chimney as if it might carry away the curse. The public house, once a place of laughter, was now a gathering ground for anxious whispers and furtive glances. The legend of the bone mill grew with every telling. Some said the missing workers had been ground into the very pulp, their souls trapped in the paper, their faces sometimes glimpsed in the flicker of candlelight. Others claimed the mill's owner had made a pact with dark forces, trading lives for prosperity. A few, emboldened by drink or desperation, spoke of taking justice into their own hands. Inspector Latham, for all his skepticism, could not ignore the power of these stories. He saw the way the townspeople looked at the mill, the way they crossed themselves when passing its gates. He heard the tales of cursed paper, of letters that brought misfortune, of books that seemed to whisper at night, of ledgers that recorded not just debts and credits, but the names of the lost. The owner, Mr. Blackwood, became a figure of both fear and fascination. He was seen less and less, his once brisk stride now a furtive shuffle. His house, perched on the edge of the mill yard, was shuttered and silent. Some said he was ill, others that he was haunted by guilt. A few claimed to have seen him wandering the mill at night, lantern in hand, speaking to shadows. The inspector, determined to bring the matter to a close, made one final push. He called for a town meeting, gathering the workers, the families of the missing, and the town's leaders in the church hall. The air was thick with anticipation and resentment. Latham spoke plainly, laying out the evidence, the limitations of the investigation, and the need for patience. He urged the town to trust in the law, to resist the pull of superstition and vengeance. But the mood in the hall was restless. The families of the missing demanded answers, their grief sharpened by months of uncertainty. The workers, fearful for their livelihoods, pleaded for the mill to be closed until the matter was resolved. The town's leaders, caught between fear and responsibility, offered only platitudes. That night, as the meeting broke up and the townspeople drifted home, a storm rolled in from the moors. Lightning flashed over the mill, illuminating its windows for a moment before plunging it back into darkness. The machine, stilled by order of the inspector, seemed to groan in the wind. The river, swollen by rain, lapped at the mill's foundations, as if eager to claim whatever secrets lay within. In the days that followed, the town's anxiety reached a fever pitch. Some workers refused to return, their places taken by the desperate or the unwary. The mill's output slowed, and the stacks of unsent paper grew higher. The owner, beset by suspicion and isolation, was seen only once more, standing at the gates in the early dawn, his face pale and drawn, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The inspector, sensing that the end was near, made one last search of the mill. He moved through the silent rooms, his lantern casting long shadows on the walls. In the grinding rooms, he paused, listening to the echo of his own footsteps. In the drying rooms, he ran his fingers over the stacks of paper, feeling for the faint, unexplainable shapes that had haunted his dreams. He found nothing new, no bodies, no confessions, no final piece of evidence to tip the scales of justice. The mill, for all its secrets, remained silent. The inspector, weary and defeated, closed his notebook for the last time. The town, left with more questions than answers, turned to legend to fill the void. The story of the bone mill became a cautionary tale, a warning whispered to children and strangers alike. The paper, once prized for its quality, was now shunned. The mill itself, its machines stilled and its windows dark, became a place to be avoided. Yet the fear lingered. Some said the spirits of the missing still wandered the mill at night, their voices carried on the wind. Others claimed that every so often a new face would appear in the paper, a silent plea for justice that would never come. The legend grew, fed by the town's grief and the inspector's failure, until it became impossible to separate fact from fiction. The bone mill, once a symbol of progress, was now a monument to loss. The town, forever changed, moved on as best it could. The inspector returned to Manchester, his reputation tarnished by a case he could not solve. The owner, Mr. Blackwood, withdrew from public life, his fate the subject of endless speculation, and the mill itself, silent and watchful on the edge of the moor, waited. Its secrets pressed into every sheet of paper, its legend growing with every telling. It became a story that would haunt Lancashire for generations to come. In the weeks after the final search, the bone mill's doors remained closed. The machines, once the pride of the town, stood silent beneath a film of dust. The river, which had carried away the waste of industry for so many years, now flowed past the mill's foundations with a kind of wary indifference. The town, exhausted by fear and suspicion, waited for a resolution that never seemed to come. Mr. Blackwood, the mill's owner, was last seen on a fog-shrouded morning, his figure barely visible as he crossed the yard and disappeared into the mill's main entrance. Some said he was gathering his papers, others that he was simply unable to leave the place that had become both his fortune and his curse. When the constable came to serve a final summons, the office was empty. Blackwood's coat hung on its peg, his ledgers stacked neatly on the desk, but the man himself was gone. A search of the mill and the surrounding moorland yielded nothing. No footprints in the mud, no sign of a struggle, no note of farewell. It was as if the owner had been swallowed by the very walls he had guarded so jealously. Some whispered that he had fled to the continent, others that he had met with foul play at the hands of those desperate for answers. A few, their voices hushed, claimed that the mill itself had claimed him, that he had become the final secret pressed into its stones. With the owner vanished and the investigation at a standstill, the town's leaders made a decision. The bone mill would be closed, its gates locked, its windows boarded. The workers, many of whom had already left in fear or despair, drifted away in search of new livelihoods. The market, once bustling with the trade in fine paper, grew quiet. The public house, where the mill's fortunes had once been toasted, became a place of remembrance and regret. The mill's closure did little to ease the town's anxiety. The building, abandoned and silent, became a magnet for stories. Children dared each other to approach its gates, to peer through the cracks in the boards and listen for the hum of ghostly machinery. Some claimed to see lights flickering in the upper windows, or to hear the faint echo of voices in the night. The legend of the bone mill grew with every telling, its details shifting and expanding to fill the gaps left by the truth. The paper produced in those final months was shunned. Merchants refused to stock it, and families burned what sheets they had, fearing the curse that was said to cling to every page. A few samples survived, tucked away in attics and trunks, their surfaces still bearing the faint, unexplainable shapes that had so unsettled the town. These relics became objects of fascination and dread, passed down through generations as proof of the mill's dark legacy. The story of the bone mill spread far beyond Lancashire. Newspapers in Manchester and London published lurid accounts of the disappearances, the mysterious owner, and the cursed paper. Writers and poets found inspiration in the tale, weaving it into their works as a symbol of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of progress. The mill became a cautionary tale, a warning against unchecked ambition and the price of secrets kept too long. For the families of the missing, there was no closure. The absence of bodies, the lack of confessions, the silence of the law all left wounds that would never fully heal. Some left the town, unable to bear the weight of memory. Others stayed, tending graves with no names, lighting candles for loved ones whose fates would never be known. The inspector, his investigation unfinished, returned to Manchester, his mind haunted by the faces of those he could not save. As the years passed, the mill's bricks began to crumble. Its roof sagged and weeds claimed the yard. Yet the building remained, a silent witness to the events that had shaped the town's history. On stormy nights, when the wind howled across the moor, some said you could still hear the hiss of steam and the distant thud of machinery. A few believed that the spirits of the missing lingered there, their stories pressed into the very walls. The legend of the bone mill became part of the town's identity. It was told in whispers at bedtime, in warnings to travelers, in the nervous laughter of those who remembered. The details changed with each retelling. Sometimes the owner was a villain, sometimes a victim, sometimes a man driven mad by forces beyond his control. But always at the heart of the story was the sense of something lost, something hidden, something that could never be fully understood. In time, the town rebuilt itself. New industries rose, new families arrived, and the memory of the bone mill faded into the background. Yet the story endured, a shadow cast across the generations. The mill itself, its windows dark and its doors chained, became a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the brave. Some came seeking answers, others simply to stand in the presence of a mystery that had never been solved. The bone mill's legacy was not just one of fear, but of caution, a reminder that progress, for all its promise, can carry a cost. The town learned to look more closely at the things it once took for granted, to question the stories it was told, to remember the faces of those who had vanished. The paper that had once carried the hopes of a community now served as a warning, its blank pages heavy with the weight of the past. And so the bone mill became more than a factory. It became a story whispered in fear, where every page told a story no one wished to read. As the mist settles once more over the Lancashire moors and the silent walls of the bone mill fade into shadow, the story lingers, unfinished, unanswered, and unforgettable. The echoes of vanished voices, the secrets pressed into every page, and the questions left behind by a vanished owner all remain, woven into the fabric of local memory and legend. But the story does not end here. It lives on in the retelling, in the questions we ask, and in the lessons we draw from the past. What do you make of the bone mill disappearances? Do you believe the truth was ever fully uncovered, or do you think some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved? How do stories like this shape the way we see our own communities, our own histories, and the progress we so often take for granted? We invite you to share your thoughts, your theories, and your own local legends in the comments below. Let us know where you're listening from and how this story resonates with you. Your voice is part of the ongoing conversation, one that stretches far beyond the borders of Lancashire, across time and place, as we seek to understand the shadows that sometimes fall across even the brightest hopes. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of a Victorian mystery. Until next time, keep questioning, keep remembering, and keep listening for the stories that history leaves behind.